stories that creep from the darkness in the darkness of the night when shadows dance in the corner of your eyes. Listen carefully because every hiss and creak might not be just the wind. Welcome to Horror Radio, where nightmares come true. The mystery of the missing child in the village of the Dancing Dead. A thin mist shrouds Blackthorn Hollow, a small village hidden in the Yorkshire moors. Gray stone houses line the cobbled streets, their roofs damp from the relentless drizzle. In the distance, Hollowwood stands like a dark wall, ancient yew trees forming an eerie circle, a place avoided by children and whispered about by adults. The village lives to a simple rhythm, farming, weaving, and praying for a mild winter, but beneath the tranquility lurks the legend of the Death Dancers. Every 10 years, on the night of All Hallows Eve, the spirits dancing under the full moon are said to take the souls of the unwary. In the heart of the village, in a simple cottage with frosted windows, lives the Gray family. Margaret Gray, a 38-year-old widow, is a strong woman with brown hair tied neatly back, though lines of worry are beginning to etch her face. She lost her husband, William, to a fever 5 years ago and now raises their 2 children alone. Her gentle eyes often gaze out into Hollowwood, as if they hold a secret she has never spoken. Margaret is known in the village for her kindness, often helping neighbors with her homemade bread or caring for other children when their mothers are busy. Her eldest son, Thomas Gray, was a 16-year-old boy with a slender build, messy brown hair, and determined green eyes. Thomas was a practical young man who believed in hard work rather than ghost stories. He often helped out on his neighbors' farms to supplement the family income, and in his spare time he sharpened his father's old hunting knife, but only to cut firewood. Thomas despised the village superstitions, especially the stories of the Death Dancer, which he saw as a way for adults to scare children. "If there are ghosts in the woods, I'll chase them away with a stick," he once said, making his friends laugh. His younger sister, Eleanor Gray, 9, was Thomas's opposite. With curly brown hair and a freckled face, Eleanor was the sunshine of Blackthorn Hollow. She loved running around the village green, chasing butterflies, or listening to the elders' stories with her eyes twinkling. Eleanor had a wild imagination. She often made up stories about fairies or adventures in the moors. Still, she wasn't entirely innocent. She knew the village feared the Hollow Wood, but her curiosity often overcame her fear. "If the Death Dancers are real, I want to see them dance," she said one afternoon, prompting Margaret to scold her in a worried tone. That morning, as usual, the village awoke to the sound of roosters crowing and footsteps on the cobblestone path. Margaret was baking bread in the fireplace, the aroma of baking flour filling the cottage. Eleanor sat on the floor, drawing a circle of yew trees with charcoal, something she had seen in her dream the night before. "Mother, is it true that people dance in the forest?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. Margaret smiled wryly, her hands pausing as she stirred the dough. "It's just a story, dear, but never go to Hollowwood alone, understand?" She looked seriously at Eleanor, but didn't explain further. Thomas, who had just entered with his arms full of firewood, overheard the conversation and snorted. "The Death Dancers? Just nonsense to frighten the children. If they're real, how come no one's ever seen them during the day?" He set the wood down hard, making Eleanor giggle. "Maybe they're afraid to dance in the sunlight, Tom," Eleanor replied, and they both laughed, though Margaret just shook her head, her face full of worry. Outside, the village began to stir. Old Man Hawthorne, a 70-year-old elder with a white beard and an oak staff, sat on a bench in front of the tavern, his old eyes fixed on Hollowwood. He was the best storyteller in the village, and the children often gathered around him to hear his tales, though the tales of the Death Dancers always made them cower in fear. "They are not ordinary spirits," he told a group of children listening, including Eleanor, who had slipped out after breakfast. "They are angry spirits, bound to the forest by ancient sins, and they are always hungry for new souls." Eleanor listened with wide eyes, her hands clutching her skirt, but she couldn't help smiling. This was like an adventure in a fairy tale to her. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the village, Widow Agnes, an old witch who lived in a hut filled with herbs, was picking rowan leaves in her garden. Agnes was a mysterious figure, with gray hair always covered by a shawl and eyes that seemed to look straight into the soul. The villagers respected her, but they also feared her. She knew things they shouldn't, like ancient spells and the secrets of the forest. When Margaret came by to deliver the bread, Agnes stared at her for a long time. "Be careful, Margaret," she said in a husky voice. "The full moon is coming, and the forest is restless." Margaret nodded politely, but her heart was pounding. She hurried back to the cottage, not wanting to think about Agnes' words. The day passed quietly, but there was tension in the air. The fog grew thicker, and the wind carried strange sounds, like whispers from the hollow wood. Eleanor, who was playing in the field with the other children, stopped for a moment and looked into the forest. She felt as if something was calling to her, though there was no clear sound. Thomas, who was repairing the fence nearby, noticed his sister and called out, "Ellie, don't daydream. Come inside, Mother's calling." Eleanor turned, smiled, and ran toward him, but her eyes remained fixed on the forest, filled with dangerous curiosity. That night, as the Gray family sat around the dinner table, the candlelight illuminated their faces. Margaret told a story of her childhood in the village, but her voice was soft, as if she didn't want to wake anything. Eleanor listened, hugging her knees, while Thomas just nodded, his mind preoccupied with plans to repair the roof before the rainy season. Outside, the wind howled, and in the distance, Hollowwood stood in the darkness, holding secrets that would soon change their lives forever. Morning in Blackthorn Hollow was greeted by a thicker-than-usual fog that enveloped the village like a gray cloak. Hollowwood, with its circle of ancient yew trees rising at the edge of the moor, looked darker, as if it were absorbing the dim sunlight. The villagers moved quickly, their voices low, as if afraid to wake something sleeping. All Hallows' Eve was only a few days away, and the legend of the death dancers, the spirits who danced under the full moon every 10 years to steal the souls of the unwary, was the subject of whispers in every corner of the village. In the tavern, in the marketplace, even in the little church, fear crept in like the morning dew. In the Gray family cottage, Margaret Gray stood by the fireplace, her hands busy stirring bean soup, but her eyes never left the window. The fog outside made her uneasy, reminding her of the stories her mother had told her of nights when the forest breathed. Margaret, with her brown hair tied back neatly, tried to remain calm for her children, but the anxiety in her chest could not be ignored. The night before, she had dreamed of a woman in white standing at the edge of Hollowwood, staring at her with empty eyes. She shook her head, trying to forget it, and concentrated on the aroma of the soup that filled the room. Eleanor Gray, her 9-year-old daughter, sat at the wooden table, her legs swaying. Charcoal in hand, she drew the same yew tree as yesterday, but this time she added a small figure in the middle, a girl, perhaps herself. "Mother, does the death dancer have a name?" she asked suddenly, her voice full of curiosity. Margaret stiffened, the wooden spoon in her hand almost dropping. "Eleanor, don't talk about that," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. "It's just an old story, but the forest is no place for children." Eleanor sulked, but her eyes remained bright, her imagination as wild as ever. To her, the legend was like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Thomas Gray, Eleanor's 16-year-old brother, entered the cottage, his jacket wet from the drizzle. He had just returned from Mr. Carver's field, where he had been hired to repair a fence. His brown hair was disheveled and stuck to his forehead, and he snorted as he overheard his mother and sister talking. "Again with the death dancer?" he said, putting a basket of firewood in the corner. "Ellie, if you keep listening to Hawthorne's stories, you'll be afraid of your own shadow." He grinned, but there was a protective tone in his voice. Thomas had always felt responsible for Eleanor, especially since her father's death, but his skepticism of the village's superstitions never wavered. "The forest is just trees and mist. There are no dancing spirits." Eleanor rolled her eyes and stuck out her tongue. "You don't know anything, Tom. I heard from Sally in the field that she saw strange lights in the forest that night." Sally was Eleanor's friend, a a 10-year-old farmer's daughter who loved to exaggerate stories. Margaret looked at Eleanor with raised eyebrows. Sally likes to lie, dear. And you, stay out of the woods, understand? Eleanor nodded, but her fingers continued to draw, adding lines that resembled dancing figures on her paper. Outside the cottage, the village pulsed with activity, tinged with tension. Children played in the small field near the church, but their laughter was quieter than usual. Old Man Hawthorne, the village elder with a white beard and the walking stick he always carried, sat on a wooden bench in front of the tavern. His cloudy eyes gazed into hollow wood as if he could see something invisible to others. As Eleanor and several other children approached, he began to tell a story, his voice deep and authoritative. 50 years ago, my sister Mary disappeared in this forest, he said. It was All Hallows Eve like tonight. I heard music, a violin wailing. But when I went to look for her, all I found was fog. The children held their breath, but Eleanor leaned closer, her eyes wide. Did she become the Grim Reaper, Mr. Hawthorne? She asked. Hawthorne looked at her, his face hardening. Be careful, child. The forest hears your questions. Meanwhile, Margaret decided to visit the small market in the center of the village, carrying a basket of bread to sell. There she met John Carver, a tall, red-faced man who often hired Thomas. Carver was a hard man, but he was always kind to the Gray family. Margaret, you'd better keep your children close, he said, his voice heavy. The village is troubled. Some say they heard voices coming from the forest last night. Margaret smiled stiffly, trying to hide her fear. It's just the wind, John. You know what the moors are like. But Carver's words made her heart beat faster. At the edge of the village, Widow Agnes brewed a potion in her hut that smelled of herbs. She heard Margaret approach and turned, her sharp eyes seeming to read her thoughts. You're worried, aren't you? Agnes asked bluntly. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Eleanor keeps talking about the forest. I'm afraid her imagination is leading her to the wrong place. Agnes nodded slowly and picked a rowan leaf from the table. The forest is alive, Margaret, and it knows that All Hallows Eve is near. Keep this. She handed her a small bundle of rowan branches tied with red thread. Leave it on your doorstep tonight. Margaret took it, though she wasn't sure what it meant. She just wanted her children to be safe. That afternoon, Eleanor played in the field with Sally and the other children. Chasing a ball of cloth that had rolled away, she stopped near the fence that separated the village from Hollow Wood. The mist in the forest seemed to be moving, creating vague shadows. Eleanor blinked, certain she had seen something, perhaps small figures, like children, moving among the yew trees. She heard soft laughter, like little bells, that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, but also made her curious. Sally, did you hear that? She asked. Sally, who was talking to another child, shook her head. Don't go there, Ellie. Mom will be mad. Eleanor smiled, but took a step forward, her eyes fixed on the forest. Thomas, who happened to be passing by after finishing his work, saw Eleanor near the fence. Ellie, what are you doing? He shouted as he came closer. Eleanor started, then laughed. Just looking, Tom. There's something in the woods, I'm sure. Thomas shook his head and took his sister's hand. You've heard too many Hawthorne stories. Let's go home. Mom's waiting. Eleanor followed, but she kept looking back, her curiosity growing. Thomas noticed his sister's expression, and for the first time he felt that something was wrong with the forest, even if he didn't want to admit it. As night fell, the Gray family gathered in their cottage. Margaret placed Agnes' rowan branch on the doorstep, hoping it was just a prank. Eleanor, already dressed for the night, hugged her knees by the fireplace, her eyes still filled with images of the forest. Thomas sat at the table, sharpening his hunting knife, his mind on tomorrow's work. Outside, the wind howled, carrying faint sounds they couldn't quite make out the soft melody of a violin. Hidden in the mist, calling from the hollow wood. The day before All Hallows Eve, Blackthorn Hollow felt as if it were holding its breath. The fog that enveloped the village grew thicker, blurring the line between the moorland and the hollow wood. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and something else, a faint, indescribable odor like rotting flowers. The villagers moved uneasily. Doors were locked earlier, and the prayers in the small church sounded more urgent. The legend of the death dancer, usually only a whisper, now loomed as a shadow pressing on every mind. The coming night was the night to fear, when the full moon would illuminate the U circle in the forest where the spirits were said to dance and take souls. In the Gray family cottage, Margaret Gray was busy preparing dinner, but her hands trembled as she cut the potatoes. The Rowan Branch widow Agnes had given her was still on the doorstep, but it did little to calm her heart. The night before, she had woken from another nightmare. The woman in white had returned, this time dancing in the center of the U circle, calling to her in a voice that was not human. Margaret tried to focus on her children, hoping that routine would dispel her fear. She glanced at Eleanor, who was sitting by the fire, singing a nursery rhyme in a happy voice. Eleanor, with her curly brown hair and freckled face, was the family's ray of sunshine. But Margaret couldn't ignore her daughter's dangerous curiosity, especially after seeing her staring at Hollow Wood yesterday. Thomas Gray, the eldest son at 16, had just returned from Mr. Carver's field. His jacket was damp from the drizzle, and his unkempt brown hair clung to his forehead. He put his shoes by the door and snorted when he heard Eleanor singing. "Ellie, you're driving the neighbors crazy with that song," he said, but his smile was gentle. Thomas was always skeptical of village superstitions, including the tales of the death dancer. To him, the forest was just trees and mist, not a haven for vengeful spirits. But as the older brother, he felt responsible for Eleanor, especially since her father had died. "Mother, are you all right?" he asked, noticing Margaret's worried expression. "Just tired, Tom," Margaret replied, lying to reassure him. That afternoon, the village children gathered in a small field near the church, playing under a sky that was turning a deep purple. Eleanor, as usual, was the center of attention, leading her friends in a game of tag. Sally, her 10-year-old friend, ran beside her, giggling. "Ellie, aren't you afraid to play here? The woods are scary," Sally said, glancing toward Hollow Wood. Eleanor smiled broadly, her eyes sparkling. "I'm not afraid. Maybe the death dancer likes to play too." Her laughter echoed, but Thomas, who was repairing a fence nearby, watched closely. He knew that Eleanor was too brave for her own good. As the game continued, a wild kitten ran across the field, its gray fur glistening in the evening light. Eleanor, who had always loved animals, shouted, "Look!" and ran after it without thinking. The kitten ran toward the fence that separated the field from Hollow Wood, then disappeared into the mist between the trees. "Come back, cat," Eleanor called as she ran past the fence, her skirt catching on a branch. Thomas, nailing a plank, heard her scream and turned. "Ellie, don't go there," he shouted. But Eleanor was already too far away, her silhouette disappearing in the mist. Thomas dropped his hammer and ran after her, his heart pounding. He reached the edge of the forest and shouted, "Eleanor, come back now." But only silence answered, broken by the howling of the wind, carrying the scent of rotten flowers. He took a few steps into the Hollow Wood, his eyes searching the darkness, but there was no sign of his sister, no footprints, no laughter. Only the mist swirled, as if swallowing the world. Thomas felt an unnatural chill that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, but he pushed the fear away. "This isn't about ghosts," he muttered to himself, trying to stay rational. Meanwhile, back at the cottage, Margaret began to worry when she realized Eleanor hadn't returned. She stepped outside and called her daughter's name into the now empty field. The other children had already dispersed, and Sally, who was still there, looked terrified. "Mrs. Gray, Eleanor chased a cat into the woods," she said, her voice shaking. Margaret's face paled. She ran panting to the edge of Hollow Wood, where Thomas had just returned. "I couldn't find them, Mother," he said, his voice full of guilt. "I only looked away for a moment." Word spread quickly throughout Blackthorn Hollow. Within hours, the village was in an uproar. Men gathered with lanterns, forming search parties under the command of John Carver, his face red with anger. "We must hurry before nightfall," he shouted. Margaret joined them, her shawl wrapped around her neck, her eyes filled with tears. "She must be frightened out there," she whispered, clutching Thomas's hand. But Old Man Hawthorne, standing near the crowd, shook his head, his oak staff tapping the ground. "It's not fear you should worry about," he said, his voice heavy. "The Death Dancers have waited a long time. They took what was theirs." Thomas stared at Hawthorne, his eyes burning. "Don't talk such nonsense," he snapped. "Eleanor is there, and I will find her." But deep inside, guilt gnawed at him. He should have been more careful, should have stopped Eleanor before she went too far. Margaret held his arm, her voice hoarse. "We'll find her, Tom. We have to." But as the lanterns entered Hollow Wood, the mist seemed to dance, swallowing light and sound, leaving the village in deeper fear. In the distance, deep in the forest, something moved among the yews. A faint melody, like the mournful cry of a violin, flowed through the mist, too faint for the seekers to hear. And in the center of the yew circle stood a small figure, her curly hair fluttering in the wind, her eyes fixed on something the world could not see. Night enveloped Blackthorn Hollow, turning the village into a sea of shadows, lit only by the flickering lanterns. The fog in the hollow grew thicker, as if refusing the light, and the air was filled with the scent of damp earth, mixed with something sweet yet rotten. The disappearance of Eleanor Gray, the 9-year-old girl who had chased a kitten into the woods that afternoon, had shaken the village to its core. The search party led by John Carver returned empty-handed, their faces pale and their voices hoarse. "The forest is like a maze," complained one man, his hands shaking as he held the lantern. In the midst of the crowd, Margaret Gray stood with a shawl around her neck, her eyes red but filled with determination. "We must search again," she said, her voice hoarse. But deep down, she knew that Hollow Wood was no ordinary place, especially tonight. In the Gray family cabin, the atmosphere was heavy. Margaret sat by the dimly lit fireplace, her hands clutching a branch of the widow Agnes's mountain ash as if it were her only hope. The dream she had of the woman in white now felt like a warning, and the fear she had tried to bury for years began to resurface. She remembered her mother's stories about the children who had gone missing in the past, always on All Hallows Eve, always without a trace. "Eleanor is strong," she whispered to herself, trying to convince her broken heart. But with each passing second, it became harder to believe that her daughter was simply lost. Thomas Gray, the eldest son, 16, stood in the corner of the room, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and guilt. His messy brown hair was damp with sweat, though he had just returned from the forest with the search party. He blamed himself. He should have been faster. He shouldn't have let Eleanor go near the Hollow Wood. His skepticism about the legend of the Death Dancer was beginning to waver, though he refused to admit it. Old Man Hawthorne's words from last night, "They took what was theirs," echoed in his mind, making him angry. "I don't believe in ghosts," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked at his mother, then picked up his father's old hunting knife from the shelf. "I'm going back to the woods, Mother. I'm going to find Ellie." Margaret stood up, her face filled with fear. "Tom, no. You don't know what's out there." She grabbed her son's arm, but Thomas gently pulled away. "I can't stay here while Ellie's alone. I promise I'll be careful." Before Margaret could protest further, Thomas grabbed the lantern and his coat, then stepped out into the cold night. The rowan branches outside the door swayed in the breeze, as if warning him. Hollow Wood greeted Thomas with an oppressive silence. The lantern in his hand could illuminate only a few steps ahead, and the mist swirled like living creatures, closing the path behind him. He called, "Eleanor, Ellie, it's Tom." But his voice was muffled, as if swallowed by the forest. Yew trees towered around him, their branches reaching out like fingers. Thomas felt an unnatural chill, his breath forming mist in the air. He tried to concentrate, reminding himself that this was just a forest, not a haunted place. But as he approached the famous U circle, something changed. A faint melody flowed through the mist, like a violin played with deep sorrow. Thomas froze, his heart pounding. "It's just the wind," he told himself. But the sound was too clear, too rhythmic. He forced his feet forward, following the melody until he reached the U circle. In the mist he saw a moving shadow, a slender silhouette, almost human, spinning in a strange, unnatural dance. Thomas swallowed hard, his hands tightening around his knife. "Eleanor!" he shouted again, his voice cracking. Suddenly there was a small laugh, a laugh he recognized, Eleanor's laugh. "Ellie?" he called, running toward the sound, through the U circle. But when he reached the source of the sound, there was nothing but mist and trees. The violin stopped playing, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. Thomas turned, the lantern in his hand trembling. "Where are you, Ellie?" he whispered, his voice filled with desperation. Something moved out of the corner of his eye, a small shadow, perhaps children, darting between the trees. He chased after it, but the shadow vanished, leaving only swaying leaves. Exhaustion and cold finally forced Thomas back to the village as the sky began to fade into the gray of dawn. He stumbled into the hut, his face pale, his eyes wild. Margaret, who hadn't slept all night, ran to embrace him. "Tom, did you find them?" she asked, her voice full of hope and fear. Thomas shook his head, his throat tightening. "I heard her laugh, Mother. She was there, I know. But something held her back." He didn't mention the tune or the shadow he'd seen, not wanting to frighten his mother any further. But for the first time, he began to wonder if the legend of the Death Dancer was more than just a story. Outside, the village awoke to worse news. Sally, Eleanor's friend, confessed to her mother that she had heard laughter coming from the forest when Eleanor disappeared, but she hadn't dared to say anything last night. John Carver, who was leading the search party, began to speak in a somber tone. "We may have to accept the truth," he said to the crowd in the field. "The forest took what it wanted." But Margaret, hearing this, refused to give up. "My daughter is still alive," she cried, her voice trembling. Old Man Hawthorne, standing near her, looked at her with clouded eyes. "You can't fight the Death Dancer, Margaret," he said quietly. "But perhaps there is a way to negotiate." Deep in the forest, in the center of the now silent U circle, mist slowly swirled. The violin's melody was no longer heard, but the air felt alive, as if waiting for the coming night, All Hallows' Eve, when the full moon would bring the Death Dancer back. The days passed slowly in Blackthorn Hollow, each hour like a nail driven deeper into the hearts of the villagers. The disappearance of Eleanor Gray had left a wound that was felt not only by the Gray family, but by the entire community. The fog in Hollow would seem to mock, thick and unyielding, hiding secrets known only to the ancient yew trees. All Hallows' Eve, the dreaded night when the Death Dancer was said to dance under the full moon, was only hours away. In the village square, whispers mingled with sobs, some blaming the Gray family, others praying that the curse of the forest would not fall upon them. In the Gray family cottage, Margaret Gray sat at the wooden table, her face pale and her eyes red from lack of sleep. She still held Widow Agnes's rowan branch, but she did not know its meaning or how to use it. Her mind was filled with images of Eleanor, her laughter, her curly hair, and her courage, which often frightened Margaret. Thomas, her 16-year-old son, stands near the door, his hands clenching a hunting knife so tightly that his knuckles are white. The night before, she had heard Eleanor's laughter in Hollow Wood, but had been unable to find her, and the guilt now felt like a crushing weight. Her skepticism about the legend of the Death Dancer faded, replaced by a burning determination to bring her sister home, no matter what lay in the forest. "We can't wait any longer, Mother," Thomas said, his voice firm, though his eyes were filled with uncertainty. "The search party has found nothing. I must go back into the forest." Margaret stared at him, her face filled with fear. "Tom, you almost didn't come back last night. I can't lose both of you." But Thomas shook his head, his eyes burning. "I heard her laugh, Mother. Ellie is still alive. I won't let the forest take her." Margaret wanted to protest, but she knew her son wouldn't listen. With a heavy heart, she nodded and said, "We need help. We'll go to Agnes." Widow Agnes lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by pungent herbs. When Margaret and Thomas arrived, Agnes was brewing a potion, her wrinkled hands moving with precision. Her sharp eyes were fixed on them as if she already knew the purpose of their visit. "I heard about Eleanor," she said, her voice hoarse but authoritative. "The forest has taken what it wanted, but it may not be too late." Margaret swallowed hard, her hands clenching a rowan branch. "What do you know, Agnes? Tell us everything." Agnes sighed and stared into the fire as if seeing the past. "The Death Dancers are not just a legend," she said. "They are the spirits of villagers sacrificed centuries ago, part of a pact with the bog spirits to keep Blackthorn Hollow fertile. Every decade, a soul is given to appease those spirits. But our ancestors broke the pact and refused to sacrifice any more children. Since then, the Death Dancers have taken what they feel is their due, especially on All Hallows Eve." Thomas snorted, though his skeptical tone was now mixed with fear. "So you're saying this forest is alive? And that's what took Ellie?" Agnes stared at him sharply. "The forest is a portal, young one, and the Death Dancers are its guardians. Eleanor is between our world and theirs, but she can still be saved if you're brave enough." She took an amulet from the table, a small circle of rowan branches and raven feathers bound with red thread. "Place this in the center of the U circle at midnight tomorrow. Only a pure heart can weaken the Death Dancer. But be careful. The forest will fight back." Margaret took the amulet, her hands shaking. "What do you mean, the forest will fight back?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Agnes just smiled faintly. "You will find out, Margaret. This village holds many secrets, and not everyone wants those secrets revealed." Back in the village, tensions were rising. John Carver, who led the search party, was beginning to lose hope. In the tavern, he spoke harshly to a group of men. "We've searched until we've searched every bone. Perhaps we should accept that the child is lost, like the others before her." His words reached Sally, Eleanor's friend, who was crying in the corner. "It's my fault," she sobbed to her mother. "I should have stopped Ellie when she was chasing that cat." News of Sally spread, and some villagers began to blame the Greys, whispering that they had awakened a curse by allowing Eleanor to go near the forest. Old Man Hawthorne, who had heard the commotion, stood outside the tavern, tapping the ground with his oak staff. "This village has forgotten its history," he said to anyone who would listen. "We thought we could escape the pact, but the forest never forgets." Some villagers nodded, others turned away, afraid to face the truth. Margaret, who happened to be passing by on her way home from Agnes' house, heard Hawthorne's words and felt her chest tighten. She knew the village was beginning to fall apart, and her family was being made the scapegoat. In the cottage, Thomas stared at the rowan charm in his mother's hand, his mind racing. "I will go into the forest tomorrow night," he said, his voice full of determination. "I will bring Ellie home." Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "You don't know what you're up against, Tom. We'll do it together." Thomas nodded, though in his heart he was determined to protect his mother, even if it meant facing the forest alone. That night, as they tried to sleep, the wind outside carried a faint sound, not the melody of a violin, but like a whisper calling from the hollow wood. Deep in the forest, in the center of a circle of yew trees, mist slowly swirled. A small figure with flowing curly hair stood in the center, his eyes blank, as if listening to a song the world could not hear. And around it, shadows began to gather, waiting for the full moon the following night. All Hallows Eve arrived in Blackthorn Hollow, bringing with it an almost unbearable tension. A gray sky covered the village, and the fog in the hollow seemed more alive, swirling like smoke with a mind of its own. The faint scent of rotting flowers grows stronger, seeping into every corner of the village. The villagers lock their doors and windows, candles are lit on the doorsteps of their homes, and whispers of prayer fill the small church. The legend of the Death Dancer, vengeful spirits who claim a life every decade, is no longer just a tale. The disappearance of Eleanor Gray is proof. In the village square, a small crowd gathers, whispering about the curse and blaming the Gray family, while others bow their heads, afraid to look toward Hollow Wood. In the Gray family cottage, Margaret Gray stands near the table, her hands clutching the Rowan amulet and raven feather given to her by Widow Agnes. Her face is pale, her eyes red from tears and lack of sleep, but her resolve is unshakable. She knows that tonight is her last chance to save Eleanor, her 9-year-old daughter, who went missing in Hollow Wood 2 days ago. Thomas Gray, her 16-year-old son, inspects his father's old hunting knife, his eyes aglow despite the guilt that still gnaws at him. The experience in the U circle, the violin melody, Eleanor's laughter, and the dancing shadows had shaken his skepticism, though he still tried to think rationally. "We must go to the forest now, Mother," he said, his voice firm. "The talisman will work. I'm not coming back without Ellie." Margaret nodded, though her heart was filled with fear. "We'll do this together, Tom," she said, pulling on her shawl and cloak. She remembered Agnes' words. The forest will fight. Whatever they faced, she would not let Thomas face it alone. Before leaving, Margaret placed a small piece of Eleanor's cloth, the one her daughter had always used to tie her hair up, in her coat pocket, as if it could bring her daughter back. They stepped outside, Thomas's lantern lighting the rocky path to Hollow Wood, the village behind them like a world of its own. Hollow Wood greeted them with an oppressive silence, broken only by the creaking of branches beneath their feet. The mist swirled faster, forming shadows that seemed to move at the corners of their eyes. Thomas led the way, lantern in left hand, knife in right, while Margaret followed, clutching the Rowan amulet tightly. The air grew colder, and the smell of rotten flowers made them sick. "This isn't like that night," Thomas whispered, his voice strained. "The forest, it feels different." Margaret nodded, feeling an unnatural presence, as if the Yews were watching them. As they approached the circle of Yews, the first obstacle appeared. The roots of the trees seemed to shift, blocking the path that had been clearly visible moments before. Thomas cut through a few branches with his knife, but each step felt heavier, as if they were walking against a river current. Suddenly, whispers flowed through the mist, not clear words, but the laughter of children mixed with ominous tones. Margaret jerked and grabbed Thomas's arm. "That's Ellie's voice," she said, her voice shaking. Thomas nodded, his eyes searching the darkness. "Stay close, Mother," he said, trying to hide his fear. The violin melody that had been faint now grew louder, wailing like a dirge. Thomas caught a glimpse of a small figure in the distance, Eleanor, her curly hair fluttering, dancing with stiff, unnatural movements. "Ellie!" he cried, running toward her, but Margaret held him back. "Tom, that might not be her," she said, remembering Agnes' warning. Eleanor's shadow vanished, and the children's laughter echoed again, this time from every direction. Thomas cursed softly, his heart pounding. "This forest is playing with us," he said, his voice filled with frustration. Suddenly, another figure emerged from the mist, John Carver, the big man leading the search party. His face was red, his eyes wild, and he held a wooden axe. "You shouldn't be here," he barked, his voice filled with unusual anger. Margaret stepped back, the amulet nearly slipping from her hand. "John, we're looking for Eleanor," she said, trying to calm him. But Carver shook his head and tightened his grip on the axe. "You don't understand. The forest must be appeased. If we continue to fight, more will be taken. Let the child go, Margaret." Thomas stepped forward, knife raised. "Stand down, Carver, or I'll make you stand down," he threatened, his eyes blazing. A brief struggle ensued. Carver swung the axe, but Thomas dodged, using his agility to keep his distance. Margaret screamed, trying to get Carver's attention, but the man was possessed. In the chaos, the Rowan amulet slipped from Margaret's hand and fell to the ground, disappearing among the roots. Thomas finally managed to shove Carver into a tree, causing the man to stumble and pass out. Thomas's breath came in gasps, his face pale. "He's crazy," he said, helping Margaret to her feet. But Margaret stared at the spot where the amulet had fallen, her heart sinking. "The amulet? We can't go on without it," she whispered, her voice full of despair. The forest seemed to respond, whispers and laughter growing louder, the violin's melody turning into a slow roar. Thomas looked at his mother, his eyes filled with determination despite the fear that lurked within. "We don't need the amulet, Mother. I'll find Ellie with or without it." Margaret nodded, though her heart was uncertain. They stepped deeper into the youth circle, unaware that shadows began to gather in the mist, their unseen eyes watching every movement. At the center of the youth circle stood a small figure, her curly hair swaying in the unnatural wind. Her eyes were empty, but her hands clutched something, a small piece of cloth that had once bound her hair, as if it were the only link she had left to the world she once knew. All Hallows Eve shrouded Blackthorn Hollow in an unnatural darkness, lit only by the low-hanging full moon, its silvery light piercing the mist of the hollow forest. The village felt like a ghost town, doors locked, windows shut tight, and candles flickering weakly on doorsteps as if afraid to go out. The stench of rotting flowers that haunted the village was now so strong that it mingled with the scent of damp earth and something darker, older. The villagers hid, praying that the death dancers, vengeful spirits who danced every decade, would not knock on their doors. But deep in the forest, in the famous youth circle, Margaret Gray and Thomas Gray, mother and son of the Gray family, had no time for fear. Eleanor, Margaret's 9-year-old daughter, had been missing in Hollow Wood for 2 days, and tonight was their last chance to save her. The loss of widow Agnes Rowan Charm had dimmed their hopes, but their resolve remained unshaken. At the edge of Hollow Wood, Margaret stood in a thick cloak, her hands clutching a small piece of Eleanor's cloth, the only reminder of her daughter. Her face was pale, her eyes red, but there was a fire in her eyes. Thomas, her 16-year-old son, held a lantern in one hand and a hunting knife in the other, his brown hair disheveled and damp from the fog. The guilt of failing to protect Eleanor drove him, turning his skepticism into burning determination. "We will bring Ellie home, Mother," he said, his voice full of conviction despite the tightness in his chest. Margaret nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Together, Tom," she whispered, gathering her strength. The forest greeted them with a biting cold, the mist swirling like living creatures. The yew trees towered above them, their branches like outstretched fingers. Each step felt heavy, as if the forest itself rejected their presence. The whispers they had heard earlier grew louder. The laughter of children mingled with ominous sounds that made their hair stand on end. The violin melody, once faint, now echoed, filled with sorrow and anger, as if calling them to the yew circle. When they reached the yew circle, the sight before them froze them. In the moonlight, the death dancers finally appeared, translucent figures in tattered robes, their faces blank, their eyes glowing like embers. They spun in a terrifying dance, their movements out of sync with the melody, like puppets moved by invisible strings. And at the center was Eleanor, her curly hair fluttering, her eyes blank. She turned with stiff movements like a living doll. Her small hands still held the ribbon that bound her hair, the only sign that she was still their child. "Ellie!" Margaret screamed, her voice cracking as she ran toward her daughter. But an unnatural wind pushed her back, like an invisible wall. Thomas held her, his eyes filled with horror and determination. "Mother, we must be careful," he cried, remembering Agnes' warning that the forest would fight back. The death dancers stopped, their heads turning simultaneously toward Margaret and Thomas, their eyes burning with ancient hatred. The violin melody changed to a roar that shook the ground. Margaret fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Give me back my daughter," she cried, her voice filled with desperation. Thomas stepped forward, the knife in his hand trembling but his grip firm. "Take me instead," he shouted, his voice echoing through the yew circle. "Let Ellie go and I will stay." Margaret jerked back, staring at her son in horror. "Tom, no," she cried, clutching his arms. But Thomas looked up at her, his eyes filled with love and determination. I must mother, for Ellie. The death dancers moved closer, the one in front, a woman in white with a faceless face nodding slowly. A voice that wasn't a voice echoed in her mind, cold and ancient. A balanced sacrifice. One soul for one soul. Thomas took a deep breath and looked at Eleanor, who was still dancing with empty eyes. He knew what he had to do, even though his heart was breaking. Margaret cried and tried to pull Thomas back, but the wind grew stronger and pushed her away. I love you, Mother. Take care of Ellie, Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. He stepped into the center of the U-circle and offered himself to the death dancer, willing to pay the price to save his sister. At the center of the U-circle in the hollow wood, All Hallows Eve reached its climax. The light of the full moon pierced the mist, illuminating the death dancers' transparent figures in tattered robes, their faces blank, their eyes glowing like embers. They stood in chilling silence, their dance movements frozen as if waiting for something. The mournful melody of the violin had turned into a low growl, shaking the ground and the air, like the breath of an ancient creature awakening. The stench of decaying flowers enveloping the forest grew stronger, mingling with the scent of cold earth, making the air feel heavy. Outside the forest, Blackthorn Hollow was gripped with fear, its inhabitants hiding, too afraid to face the spirits that had taken Eleanor Gray. Margaret Gray kneels at the edge of the U-circle, tears streaming down her pale face, her hands clutching a small piece of Eleanor's cloth. Her cries for her daughter go unanswered, and now a new horror strikes her. Thomas, her 16-year-old son, has offered himself as a sacrifice to save his sister. Thomas stood in the center of the circle, his unkempt brown hair fluttering in the unnatural wind, a hunting knife trembling in his hands, but his eyes filled with determination. The guilt of failing to protect Eleanor had driven him to this point, and he was willing to pay any price to bring his sister home. Take me, he shouted again, his voice breaking but strong, challenging the death dancers. Let Ellie go. The death dancers remained silent, their glowing eyes fixed on Thomas. The figure at the front, a woman in white with a faceless face, raised her hand, and an ancient, cold voice echoed in Margaret and Thomas's minds. A balanced sacrifice. One soul for one soul. Are you truly willing? Thomas swallowed hard, his breath coming in gasps, but he nodded. I am willing, he said, staring at Eleanor, who still stood in the center of the circle, her curly hair flying, her eyes empty, dancing with stiff movements like a doll. The ribbon in her small hand was the only sign that she was still their child. Margaret screamed, Tom, no, and tried to crawl toward her son, but an unnatural wind pushed her back like an impenetrable wall. I can't lose you both, she sobbed, her voice filled with despair. She looked at Eleanor, then at Thomas, her heart torn between her two children. But Thomas turned away, his eyes gentle despite the tears. Mother, this is the only way. Protect Ellie. Tell her I love her. The words cut Margaret like a knife, but before she could protest, the death dancer moved. The white-clad woman stepped forward, her translucent hands reaching for Thomas. Other figures began to dance again, their movements faster, more frenzied, as if celebrating the sacrifice to come. The wail of the violin reached its climax, shaking the yews, and the mist swirled like a storm. Thomas closed his eyes, his body trembling, but his legs remained firm. He remembered Eleanor's laughter, their games in the field, and his promise to always protect her. I'm ready, he whispered, his voice nearly drowned out by the roar. Suddenly, something happened. Eleanor, who had been dancing with empty eyes, jerked awake. Her hands, clutching the fabric of her hair, trembled, and a glimmer of awareness flickered in her eyes. Tom, she whispered, her voice faint, barely audible. The sound was like thunder in a storm, bringing the death dancer to a halt. The woman in white turned to Eleanor, her eyes narrowing. Margaret, hearing her daughter's voice, rose with renewed strength. Eleanor, she cried, crawling toward the circle despite the wind trying to stop her. Thomas opened his eyes and saw his sister, his heart racing. "Ellie, hold on," he cried, trying to step toward her. But the white-clad woman's hand gripped his arm, cold as ice. "The choice has been made." The ancient voice echoed again, filled with anger. But Eleanor, with her last ounce of strength, threw the haircloth at Thomas. The cloth landed at her brother's feet, and instantly the violin melody stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The death dancers roared, their voices like winds of destruction. The mist swirled more wildly, and the U-circle seemed to come to life, its roots moving like snakes. Margaret, driven by a mother's love, broke through the wall of wind, grabbed the haircloth, and embraced Eleanor, who had fallen to the ground and regained consciousness. "Mother," Eleanor whispered, her voice weak but filled with warmth. Margaret cried and held her daughter tightly, but horror struck again when she saw Thomas. A woman in white pulled Thomas into the center of the circle, and in an instant his form faded, swallowed by the swirling mist. "Tom!" Margaret screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the death dancer. The forest fell silent, the mist dissipated, and the U-circle was empty once more, leaving only Margaret and Eleanor, sobbing in her mother's embrace. Thomas was gone, traded for his sister's life, as the old pact demanded. In the distance, the full moon still shone, but its light now felt cold, as if mourning the sacrifice that had just been made. In the village, candles flickered in doorways, as if sensing that the death dancer's curse had claimed another victim. Dawn broke over Blackthorn Hollow, bringing a pale light that struggled to pierce the thin fog that still shrouded the village. Hollow Wood, which had been a scene of horror the night before, was now silent, the yew trees standing still like mute witnesses to a secret that would never be told. The foul smell of rotten flowers that had haunted the village had faded, replaced by the scent of damp earth and morning dew. All Hallows' Eve had passed, but the wounds it left behind felt eternal. Villagers who had been hiding in fear began to open their doors and whisper about what had happened in the forest. But for the Grey family, the bitter victory over the death dancer brought unspeakable sorrow. Margaret Grey walked slowly toward the village, her arms wrapped tightly around Eleanor, her 9-year-old daughter, who had finally returned to her embrace. Eleanor, with her tangled brown curls and pale face, walks with feeble steps, her eyes still haunted by her experiences in Hollow Wood. The headband she threw away last night is gone, but her mother's warmth is the anchor that keeps her grounded in this world. Margaret, her face etched with lines of grief, tried to smile for her daughter, but her heart was shattered. Thomas, her 16-year-old son, had given himself to the death dancer to save Eleanor, and that loss felt like a knife that kept stabbing. "Am I dreaming, Mother?" Eleanor asked, her voice small, as they approached the Grey family cottage. She couldn't remember exactly what had happened in the U-circle, only flashes of dancing, the melody of a violin, and Thomas's voice calling her. Margaret swallowed her tears and stroked her daughter's hair. "You're safe now, dear," she said, her voice hoarse. "That's what matters." But she couldn't tell the truth, that her brother had paid the price for her freedom. Every step toward the hut felt like a betrayal of Thomas, now trapped in a place she couldn't imagine. The village began to come back to life, but the atmosphere was heavy. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces a mixture of relief and fear as they saw Margaret and Eleanor. Sally, Eleanor's friend, ran up to them, her eyes red from crying. "Ellie, you're back," she cried, hugging her friend. But Eleanor smiled only weakly, too weak to respond. John Carver, who had attacked Margaret and Thomas in the woods the night before, stood at a distance, his face filled with regret. He couldn't explain what had driven him to stop them, only muttering, "The forest, it drove me mad." Margaret looked at him without anger, just exhaustion. "It wasn't your fault, John," she said quietly, though her heart didn't quite forgive him. Old Man Hawthorne, the village elder, approached Margaret, his oak staff tapping the ground. His clouded eyes looked at Eleanor, then at Hollow Wood. "The child is back, but at what cost?" he asked in a low voice. Margaret tensed but didn't answer. Hawthorne nodded as if he understood. The curse may be stopped for now, but the forest never forgets its pact. His words caused the other villagers to whisper, some in fear, others in respect. Some began to call Thomas a hero, but the whispers only added to the pain in Margaret's heart. In the hut, Margaret tucked Eleanor in by the fireplace and gave her some warm soup. Eleanor stared at the fire, her eyes blank. "Where is Tom, Mother?" she asked suddenly, her voice full of hope. Margaret froze, her hands shaking. She wanted to lie, but her eyes could not hide the truth. "Tom did something very brave for you," she finally said, her voice breaking. "He loved you, Ellie." Eleanor's brow furrowed, as if she felt a loss she couldn't understand. She hugged her mother and they cried together, the fire in the fireplace flickering as if grieving with them. That afternoon, Margaret went to the widow Agnes's cabin in search of answers. Agnes, her gray hair hidden under a shawl, was brewing a potion, but her eyes were filled with compassion as she looked at Margaret. "I know what happened," she said before Margaret could speak. "Thomas paid the price the forest demanded. But don't lose hope, Margaret. The soul taken by the death dancer isn't always lost forever." Margaret stared at her, a small spark of hope igniting in her chest. "What do you mean? Can I bring Tom back?" Agnes shook her head slowly. "The forest has its own rules, but your love, family love, may be stronger than this ancient pact. Discover the secret of the village, Margaret. Start there." Back at the cottage, night was falling, and Eleanor was asleep in her bed, breathing softly. Margaret sat beside her, looking at her daughter's face, then at the window overlooking Hollow Wood. She knew the fight was not over. Thomas was still out there, somewhere between worlds, and she vowed to find him no matter what the cost. Outside, the wind blew gently, carrying faint sounds, not the melody of a violin, but like whispers of names, Eleanor, or perhaps Thomas. As if the forest had not finished speaking. 2 weeks had passed since the night of All Hallows' Eve that shook Blackthorn Hollow. The fog that had once shrouded the village was now thinner, as if the hollow forest had taken a breath after consuming its victims. The yew trees in the forest were silent, but the village still lived in the shadow of the Death Dancer legend. The villagers began to return to their routines. Fields were plowed. The small market bustled again, but their conversations were filled with whispers of Eleanor's return and Thomas's disappearance. Some call her a hero, others dare not speak her name for fear the forest will hear. In the midst of it all, the Gray family struggles to make sense of their grief. In the Gray cottage, Margaret Gray sits by the fireplace, sewing patches on Eleanor's cloak. Her face is still pale, the lines of grief deeper, but her eyes now hold a new resolve. Thomas's sacrifice to save Eleanor had shattered her heart, but widow Agnes' words, "A soul taken is not always lost forever," gave her a glimmer of hope. She vowed to uncover the village's secret, to find a way to bring Thomas back, even if it meant facing the forest once again. Every night, she looked out her window into the hollow wood and prayed that her son was still out there, waiting. Eleanor Gray, now 9 years old, sits on the floor and draws with charcoal. Her drawings are not as colorful as they once were. Now she draws circles of yew, dark trees, and a vague figure that resembles Thomas. The trauma of the forest still haunts her, though she doesn't remember the details, only flashes of dancing, the melody of a violin, and her brother's voice calling out. "Mother, will Tom come back like me?" she asks, her voice small, her eyes full of hope. Margaret holds her breath and tries to smile. "We will find him, dear," she answers, her voice soft but firm. "Tom is very brave and we will not give up on him." That morning, Eleanor found something in her coat pocket, an old piece of cloth with an ancient symbol, like a circle with lines that resembled a dance. She didn't know where it came from, but she felt it was important. Carefully, she brought it to Margaret. "Look, Mom, is this from Tom?" she asked, her eyes shining for the first time since her return. Margaret looked at the cloth, her heart pounding. The symbol was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that felt alive, like a trace of another world. "We must show this to Agnes," she said, her voice full of cautious hope. The scent of herbs greeted them at Widow Agnes' hut. Agnes, her eyes piercing behind her gray shawl, examined the cloth carefully. "It's a sign of the bog spirits," she said in a low voice. "Not of the dance of death, but of something older, something that binds the forest to the village. Thomas may still be there, at the edge of our world and theirs." Margaret stared at her, her breath coming in gasps. "What does that mean? Can we save him?" Agnes nodded slowly. "Perhaps, but it means uncovering the secrets of the village's ancient pact. Many do not want those secrets revealed. Margaret, you must be prepared." Back in the village, the mood began to change. Some villagers, like Sally and her mother, brought bread and soup to the Grey Lodge in a show of solidarity. But others, including some of the elders, looked at the Greys with suspicion. "They made a mess of things," whispered one woman at the market. "Bringing the child back will only make the forest angry again." John Carver, still haunted by his regret for attacking Margaret and Thomas, tried to atone for his mistake by helping out on the Grey farm, but he avoided talking about the forest. Old Man Hawthorne, who often sat outside the tavern, just shook his head when asked about Thomas. "The forest takes what it wants," he said, but there was something in his eyes that he didn't say. That afternoon, Margaret began searching for clues to the old pact. She visited the small church where the village records were kept. Among the dusty books, she found an old document that mentioned a pact with the swamp and sacrifices for the fertility of the land. But many pages were torn, as if someone had tried to hide the truth. Margaret jotted down what she found, determined to continue her search even though she knew it was dangerous. "For Tom," she whispered to herself, clutching the cloth with the ancient symbol. Night fell, and Eleanor sat by the window, gazing out at the hollow wood. She was no longer afraid of the forest, only empty without Thomas. Suddenly, the wind carried a faint sound, not the terrifying violin melody, but a soft song, like a lullaby Thomas had once sung. Eleanor smiled slightly, sensing that her brother was still out there. "I'll find you, Tom," she whispered, her hand touching the window pane. Outside, the crescent moon had replaced the full moon, its light soft but cold. Hollow would remain silent, but deep within, something stirred. Not the dance of death, but the faint traces of a soul not yet fully departed, waiting for a call from the world it once loved. A year had passed since the night of All Hallows' Eve that changed Blackthorn Hollow forever. The small village in the valley of the Yorkshire moors now felt brighter, the fog that shrouded the grey stone houses less frequent. Hollowwood still stood in the distance, the ancient yews still guarding their secrets, but the fear of the death dancer had faded, replaced by respect for the sacrifice that had broken the curse. In the Grey family cottage, Margaret Grey stood near the wooden table, her hands clutching an old notebook filled with scribbles. Over the past year, she had become the village historian, working alongside Widow Agnes to uncover the secrets of the ancient pact that bound Blackthorn Hollow to the spirits of the moors. Her face still bore the scars of grief from the loss of her 16-year-old son, Thomas, who had sacrificed himself to save Eleanor, but her eyes were now filled with purpose. She was seeking answers not only to bring Thomas back, but also to ensure that no other child was lost to the forest. "We cannot forget the past," she said to herself, tracing the ancient symbols Eleanor had discovered a year ago. Eleanor Grey, now 10, sits by the fireplace, drawing with charcoal. Her drawings still have the circles of you and the faint outline of Thomas, but now there is a hint of color small flowers in the corner of the paper, a sign that her joy is slowly returning. The trauma of Hollowwood still haunted her, but she found strength in the memory of her brother. "Mother, will Tom be proud of us?" she asked, her eyes shining. Margaret smiled and stroked her daughter's curly hair. "He is very proud, Ellie, and will continue to make him proud." Eleanor nodded, then returned to her drawing, vowing in her heart to continue her mother's work when she grew up. The village had changed since Thomas's sacrifice. Margaret, with Agnes's help, had convinced the villagers to hold an annual memorial service in the village square, a simple ceremony to honor the lost children. including Thomas and Old Man Hawthorne's sister, Mary, who had disappeared 50 years before. The ceremony took place each October, with candles lit around the newly erected memorial stone, engraved with the names of the victims. Villagers like Sally and her mother helped by bringing wildflowers to place on the stone, while John Carver, now more reserved, donated wood for benches around the field. Even some of the elders, who had once been wary, now attended the ceremony, albeit with somber faces. Old Man Hawthorne, now slower on his feet, often sat near the memorial stone, his oak cane leaning beside him. "This village has finally learned," he said to Margaret one afternoon, his eyes fixed on hollow wood. "But the forest never really sleeps." Margaret nodded, knowing that the words were true. The documents she found in the church, though many were tattered, revealed that an ancient pact had been made by the village's founders to keep the land fertile. But betrayal of the bog spirits had turned it into a curse. She was still searching for clues about the threshold of the world Agnes had mentioned, hoping it might be the key to saving Thomas. Widow Agnes, now more willing to share her knowledge, helped Margaret compile notes on ancient legends and symbols. "The sign Eleanor found is a call," she said one night, pointing to an old cloth with symbols of circles and dancing lines. "Not from the dance of death, but from an older spirit, one that could be appeased with love, not sacrifice." These words gave Margaret the strength to continue, even though she knew the journey was long. Agnes also taught Eleanor some simple protection spells, which made the girl feel closer to her sister. In the field, the first memorial ceremony was held that night. The villagers gathered, candles flickering in the darkness, and Margaret stood before the memorial stone, her voice firm yet filled with emotion. "We remember those we have loved," she said, "and we vow to protect the future so that no one else is lost." Eleanor stood beside her, holding a small candle, her eyes fixed on the hollow wood. She felt that Thomas was there, somehow listening. That night, as the village slept, Margaret and Eleanor sat in the cottage and read the notes together. The ancient symbols on the cloth remained a mystery, but they knew it was the thread that connected them to Thomas. "We'll find it, Mother," Eleanor said, her voice filled with childlike certainty. Margaret smiled and hugged her daughter. "We will, dear, together." Outside, the wind blew gently, carrying the fresh scent of the moor, and for the first time in a year, Blackthorn Hollow felt like home again. Night fell over Blackthorn Hollow, bringing a cool breeze that caressed the gray stone houses in the moorland valley. 1 year after the fateful night of All Hallows' Eve that shook the village, Blackthorn Hollow had found a new peace. Hollow Wood, with its ancient yew trees, was no longer feared as it once was, though it still held secrets that would never be spoken. The villagers lived at a slower pace, honoring the past with annual commemorations led by Margaret Gray. Candles were still lit in the field each October to remember those who had died, including Thomas Gray, the hero whose sacrifice had broken the Death Dancer's curse. In the Gray family cottage, Margaret Gray sits by the fireplace, her notebook open on her lap. For the past year, she has been documenting the history of the village's ancient pact, working with the widow Agnes to understand the spirits of the moor and the ancient symbols Eleanor discovered. Though she has yet to find a way to bring Thomas back, she never gives up. Her face, once etched with grief, now radiates a calm determination. She believes her family's love is strong enough to transcend the boundaries of the world. As Agnes once said, "Thomas is still out there," she whispers, gazing at the old cloth with its circle symbols and dance lines, now stored in a wooden box beside her. Eleanor Gray, now 10 years old, stood near the window, gazing at the hollow wood illuminated by the crescent moon. The trauma of the forest had faded, replaced by the courage born from the memory of her brother. She still drew you circles, but now her drawings were filled with hope wildflowers, the sun, and the smiling figure of Thomas. "Mother, are we going back to the forest?" she asks, her voice filled with the curiosity that once led her into danger. Margaret smiles and approaches her daughter. "Not yet, dear, but one day we'll be ready. For Tom." Eleanor nods, her hand clutching the small pendant Agnes made, carved with a protective symbol. The village has learned from its past. The The memorial ceremony, now a tradition, had united the people. Sally, Eleanor's friend, often helped arrange flowers at the memorial, while her mother brought bread to share. John Carver, who had found peace after his remorse, now volunteered to tend the field, his face softer than before. Old Man Hawthorne, though he now spends more time in the tavern, still tells the story of his sister Mary, but with a more hopeful tone, as if Thomas's sacrifice had given new meaning to their loss. "This village owes a debt to that boy," he said one afternoon, his eyes fixed on the memorial stone. Widow Agnes, now revered as the village storyteller, continues to guide Margaret and Eleanor. She teaches them about the spirits of the moorland, which she believes are not only vengeful but also guardians of balance. "Thomas changed the rules of the forest," she says one night, holding a cloth with ancient symbols in her hands. "His love for Eleanor weakened the death dancer. If you keep searching, you may find the door to the threshold of the world." These words become a guiding light for Margaret, urging her to continue her quest even though the answers remain elusive. That night was Eleanor's 10th birthday, and the village celebrated simply. The villagers brought cakes and small gifts, a sign that the Gray family was now an integral part of the community. Eleanor, in a simple dress, smiled broadly as Sally presented her with a bouquet of wildflowers. But as the night grew late, she sat alone in her room, gazing out at Hollow Wood. The wind blew softly, carrying a strange sound, not the terrifying melody of a violin, but a soft song, like the lullaby Thomas had sung to her when she was little. "Tom," Eleanor whispered, her eyes shining. She smiled, feeling that her brother was there somehow, telling her that she was okay. Margaret joined her and hugged her daughter from behind. "Did you hear something, dear?" she asked, watching Eleanor's expression. "Tom's song," Eleanor replied, her voice full of conviction. Margaret held her breath, unsure if it was her daughter's imagination or a sign from the forest. But she chose to believe, for her love for Thomas was what kept her going. "We'll keep looking," she said, her voice soft but firm. Eleanor nodded, leaning against her mother, and they looked out into the forest, illuminated by the soft moonlight. The story of Blackthorn Hollow ends with a message. Sacrifice for love can break a curse, but some mysteries remain unsolved, like the song that continues to echo through the forest. The village has learned to live with the legend, honoring the past while looking to the future with hope. In the depths of the Hollow Wood, the shadows no longer danced, but faint traces of souls filled with love remained, waiting for the day when the Gray family could be reunited.